In our gospel lesson that Spencer just read, we hear Jesus tell his disciples to pray always. He then continues to tell a parable, and there's much that can be said about that parable. But I'm going to ignore that tonight because I want to focus on prayer itself. What is prayer? And how can we go about praying always? As a starting point for thinking about prayer, I want to introduce to you 4 essential prayers that I think everybody in this chapel almost certainly has already experienced. The first of these essential prayers is what we've talked about during the past 2 weeks of chapel. Thanks. It does not need to be said out loud. It might simply be a grunt of gratitude. As an example, think about a time when you were really hungry and you sat down to a warm, delicious meal. How did that feel? When our hearts are filled with an awareness of abundance, with an awareness of opportunity, our response to that is thanks, whether we say it or not. Now, the second of these essential prayers is wow. Have you ever looked at the night sky and had a feeling of almost half panic, half amazement, because just for a moment you are grasped by how small our planet is in the universe? Or similarly, have you ever been so caught up in a moment of beauty, a sunset, a song, a laugh, that words could not possibly capture the experience? Even as such moments are happening to us, we are aware that we can't hold on to them because they're not for us to possess. We feel them slipping right through our fingers. But when our hearts and minds are pushed beyond our capacity to comprehend and into a state of wonder, our response is wow. The third essential prayer is help. Surely this is a prayer with which every Woodberry boy is familiar. I have seen it in many of your eyes as you approach a difficult math test. Or on New Boy Sunday, as third graders launch themselves into a new life surrounded by strangers here at the forest. In more serious cases, I've witnessed Woodberry boys experience this prayer when they realize their nicotine addiction is more than they can handle by themselves. Or when they are crushed by various pressures and disappointments such that they are crippled with anxiety. In each of these cases, when we reach the limit of our ability and become aware of our own insufficiency, our response is help. And the final essential prayer is sometimes the most difficult. Sorry. Not a mundane sorry for superficial mistakes that we often say without thinking it, but the kind of gut-wrenching realization that we have committed a fundamental error and it is our fault. For some of you, it might be like waking up at 11 o'clock and realizing you slept through your first 4 periods, including a major assessment. And you just have that sinking, gut-wrenching feeling of, oh, I screwed up. Or even more significantly, imagine making a mistake and telling a mean joke about a close friend without realizing that they were standing right behind you. What do these experiences feel like? When we experience sinking, gnawing feelings of regret, our response is sorry. Sometimes even if it's not verbal. Thanks. Wow. Help. And sorry. These are simple words, but they are words that articulate human experiences that tap into our deepest desires and insecurities. These words, when they are prayers, cannot be generated by us. On the contrary, they are responses to a lived reality, drawn out of our awareness of a gratitude, wonder, insufficiency, or regret that is bigger than us. In this sense, prayer isn't so much about acting or saying certain words as it is about learning how to engage with a reality that exists apart from our trivial daily concerns. Thanks, wow, help, and sorry. Learning to say those 4 words, learning how to identify their origin and how to respond to the reality which they represent, is a good starting point for all of us as we learn how to pray. I have students at Woodberry in my ministry who practice reflecting on these prayers every day. And without exception, over time, those who chose to do it noticed that these prayers were always relevant in some form or fashion in their lives. Because there is always a good reason at any moment of our lives to say thanks, or wow, or help, or sorry. And this increasing awareness of these realities in our lives, a constant response and dialogue with a reality that is larger than us, is what I might imagine Jesus means when he tells his disciples to pray always. He certainly isn't saying to get on your knees and mumble prayers in Latin for 24 hours a day. He's talking about a state of being. But make no mistake about it, learning how to cultivate these essential prayers is challenging because they demand brutal honesty. We don't do ourselves or God any favors by praying what we think God wants to hear. That's just not. In order for us to grow into our life of prayer, we must strip away our self-deception. And there is no more difficult task for human beings than taking off our mask with each other and with God in particular. Now, the image that we received in Genesis, our first reading this evening, is prayer as a wrestling match. Jacob encounters a strange man by the river, and they wrestle all night long until daybreak. In the midst of this wrestling match, Jacob dislocates his hip, and he limps for the rest of his life. Now, as it turns out, it seems that this strange man is gone. And so Jacob is renamed and anointed Israel, which means simply one who struggles with God. However, I think it might be fair for us to say that the man who wrestles Jacob is God in man's image, both literally and metaphorically. So the man is who Jacob projects God to be. Or to say it in a slightly different way, Jacob is wrestling with a projection of himself as God. All of us wrestle with these sorts of projections because we all imagine ourselves to be more attractive and decent and charitable than we actually are. We don't like to look at ourselves honestly because we will likely see a person in the mirror who is hardly recognizable to the person who we project to the world. In this light, Jacob's wrestling match relates closely to Jesus' admonition to pray always. In order to cultivate our awareness of the essential prayers, thanks, wow, help, and sorry, we need to be honest with ourselves and with God. And this means wrestling our fantasies into submission. In order to experience gratitude, we must acknowledge our entitlements. In order to experience wonder, we must acknowledge our incomprehension. In order to ask for help, we must acknowledge our limitations. In order to say that we are sorry, we must acknowledge our faults. This kind of self-awareness is extraordinarily difficult to cultivate. And I would suggest it is the end goal of our entire academic, athletic, and artistic program. And this is why a wrestling match is an appropriate image. There is no sport, says me, and I think I'm right, that is so individually demanding and potentially humiliating as meeting an opponent on the wrestling mat one-on-one. It is a harrowing exercise, and any of our wrestlers will share that with you. And we rarely walk away from such matches unscathed, just as Jacob limped away with a dislocated hip. This kind of self-awareness, this kind of prayer, it seems, is a full contact sport for the soul. It requires of us brutal honesty, courageous self-assessment, constant vigilance to return to the essentials. Thanks. Wow, help, and sorrow. My prayer for us all tonight is that we might be given the grace to undertake this kind of spiritual quest here at Woodberry Forest School. And that, like Jacob in Genesis, we may never give up. Amen.